Camping should be a peaceful adventure, an escape into nature. But what would you do if what you found outside was not peace but terror? These are 6 real stories of people who have had terrifying experiences in the midst of nature. Sinister encounters that will make you think twice before pitching your tent. Get ready for reports that turned a simple camping trip into a nightmare no one should have to live through. Welcome to the channel where every ride could be your last. Here we tell the darkest and most disturbing stories of drivers and passengers who have faced the unexplainable on the roads. If you like feeling that chill down your spine, subscribe now, hit the bell so you don't miss any chilling stories and share them with your brave friends. Get ready, because the next race could be yours. Night in the Colorado forest. Camping has always been a family tradition for Ethan, his father, and his 2 younger brothers, Jacob and Lucas. From an early age, Ethan learned to hunt, fish, and explore the woods that surrounded his home in Colorado Springs. For him, nature has always been a safe place, a refuge away from the trap of the city. But that night something was different. The forest they knew so well seemed to be alive in an eerie way. It was an autumn night. Dry leaves covered the forest floor, and the icy wind shook the trees like restless giants. They arrived at their usual camping spot in San Juan National Park, about 50 kilometers from home. The trip was peaceful, and everyone was excited to spend the night around the campfire. As night fell, they set up their tents and lit a fire. The comforting heat of the flames chased away the cold, and the crackle of the burning wood was almost relaxing. Ethan prepared dinner, and after they ate, they sat down to tell stories. Jacob and Lucas, aged 12 and 15, loved it when Ethan started telling horror stories. "Okay, this is a story that happened here, near where we're camping," Ethan said, dropping a lower, somber voice to set the right mood. "They say that many years ago, a group of hunters disappeared in this forest. They were last seen on a stormy night like this one that is brewing. And to this day, no one knows what really happened to them." Jacob gave a nervous smile, but Lucas, the youngest, looked around, visibly uncomfortable. "That's just a story, right, Ethan?" said Lucas. "Of course it is," Ethan replied, winking. "But stories always have a grain of truth, don't they?" At that moment, the wind picked up, and the leaves around them began to move in a way that was still just being blown by the wind. Ethan stopped talking for a moment, frowning. "That was strange," he invented, but continued the joke. "Well, they say that the hunters never left these forests, and that, on nights like this, you can hear them wandering through the trees, looking for their next prey." Lucas and Jacob started to laugh nervously, but before they could comment, someone interrupted them. Crack! Something heavy had stepped on a branch near the camp. The 3 brothers froze. The sound wasn't that of a small animal, and it was too close to be anything harmless. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and pointed it into the woods. The light only illuminated the first few rows of trees, but beyond that, there was only darkness. "It's probably just a deer," Ethan said, trying to remain calm so as not to scare his brothers. But inside he knew something was wrong. The air around seemed to be different, colder, denser. For a few minutes the sound ceased, and silence reigned around the camp. They focused back on the fire, trying to shake off the fear that had settled in the air. A few hours passed, and already tired, they decided it was time to sleep. They put out the fire and entered the tents. Ethan stayed in the larger tent with Jacob, while Lucas stayed in the smaller tent next door. The night became eerily silent, and Ethan fell asleep. In the middle of the night, he was awakened by a soft sound, almost like a suggestion coming from outside. "Ethan, Ethan." He opened his eyes, confused and scared. The voice was low, almost imperceptible, but it was calling out to him. For a moment he thought it was Lucas or Jacob, but as he looked around he saw that they were both fast asleep. The voice continued. Without making a sound, Ethan grabbed his flashlight and left the tent. The cold wind cut into his skin, and the darkness around him felt even more oppressive. He turned toward the direction the sound was coming from, the dense forest ahead. The flashlight shook in his hands as he lit the way. There was nothing there, just trees swaying gently in the wind. But then he came back. "Think here." The sound was clearer now, but it was not a human voice. There was something wrong. Ethan turned to go back to the tent, but something in the back of his mind stopped him. He needed to see what it was. Against his instinct, he took a few steps into the darkness, his flashlight illuminating the ground in front of him. That's when he saw something. At first, it looked like a figure among the trees, a shadow that moved slowly as if it were watching him. Ethan stopped, fear creeping up his spine. The figure was standing still, looking directly at him, but the darkness was so intense that he couldn't make out its face. Suddenly the figure moved. With quick, light steps, she began to run towards Ethan. His heart raced and he had time to react badly. With a scream of pure terror, He turned and ran back towards the camp, feeling the presence of the figure behind him, getting closer and closer. Upon reaching the tent, he ran out, agreeing Jacob and Lucas with a shout. "There's something out there," he said, panting. The two brothers, confused and still loud, looked at him without understanding. But before he could respond, the sound of quick footsteps around the camp began. There were difficult steps, as if several people were running in circles around the tents. The sound intensified and fear took over the three. Ethan chose a hunting knife that his father always took on trips and held on tight, ready to face whatever was out there. But suddenly the children stopped. The silence was guaranteed. They waited in silence, their eyes fixed on the tent entrance, waiting for something to emerge. But nothing happened. At dawn, we cautiously left the tent. The camp looked intact as if nothing had happened, but the footprints around the tents were unmistakable. They were big, deep, and surrounded the entire camp as if something, or someone, had been watching them all night. Without thinking twice, they broke camp and returned home. None of the three brothers spoke about what happened that night, but they all knew that something in the forest had been chased. And Ethan, since that day, never went back to camp. Panic in the Arizona desert. Camping in the desert can be a peaceful and solitary experience, but it can also reveal its own horrors. Carter was an adventurous young man who always looked for remote places to camp. He loved the solitude of the desert, the vast open landscapes, and the silence that only the desert at night could provide. That's how he found himself in the Sonoran Desert in southern Arizona, for a camping trip that, for him, would be one among many others. The day was hot, as expected in the desert. Carter arrived at his local campsite late in the afternoon, pitched his tent and built a small fire. The sky was clear, and the sun set quickly, turning the horizon orange and red. As darkness set in, he sat by the fire, drinking strong coffee and watching the stars appear in the sky, one by one. The absolute silence of the desert was almost comforting, and Carter enjoyed the peace. But that night something strange happened. As the hours passed, he began to feel a slight sense of discomfort, as if he were being watched. He looked around, but everything seemed normal. Just the vast desert and the starry sky. Not long after, he encountered a distant sound, a soft howl that echoed across the desert. Probably a coyote, he thought, although it had something unusual about it, a lower pitch than the howls he was used to hearing on his other trips. He ignored the sound and continued relaxing by the fire. Around 11 o'clock at night, Carter decided it was time to sleep. He put out the fire, climbed into the tent and settled into his sleeping bag. The desert cold began to set in and the air was colder. He fell asleep quickly, but was awakened a few hours later by a disturbing sound. It was a low, continuous whistle that seemed to be coming from somewhere outside the tent. Carter opened his eyes, his heart racing. He was quiet for a few moments, trying to understand what was winning. The whistling continued, almost as if someone was outside his tent, calling him. Fear gripped Carter, but he probably knew what he was winning against. He slowly turned on his flashlight and turned it on. Taking a deep breath, he unzipped the tent and brought the light out. The desert was silent. The wind was blowing lightly and the whistling had stopped. He looked around, trying to see something, but there was nothing in sight. "I must be imagining things," he said as he closed the tent again and tried to go back to sleep. However, as soon as he lay down, the associate returned. This time, louder and closer. The sound chilled his spine, and Carter knew it wasn't a figment of his imagination. Something or someone was out there. He spoke quickly and left the tent, now focused on finding the source of the sound. With flashlight in hand, he walked around the camp, illuminating the desert. It was then that he saw something along. There was a tall and thin figure standing on the horizon line, about 100 meters away. The body looked human, but something was wrong. The shape was disproportionate, with arms that were too long and legs that were skeletal. And, most disturbingly, the figure was motionless, looking directly at him. Carter felt the fear turn into panic. He backed away slowly, not taking his eyes off the figure, but when he took a step back, she began to move towards him. It wasn't a run, but rather a quick, fluid walk, as if gliding along the ground. Without thinking twice, Carter ran back to the tent, zipped it tightly, and grabbed a knife he carried with him for emergencies. His heart was beating so fast he could barely breathe. Outside, the sound of footsteps gets closer and closer. He held the knife tightly, expecting the worst. For a moment, the sound stopped. The silence was unbearable, and Carter stood there in a cold sweat. He knew something was outside the tent, but he didn't have the courage to go out and confront it. Then, out of nowhere, the whistling came again, louder now, as if it were right next to his head. Carter covered his ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. The associate seemed to penetrate directly into his mind. And then, the tent began to sway slightly as if someone was touching it from the outside. Panic gripped Carter. He spoke, but the sound of his own voice was drowned out by the incessant whistling. He knew I needed to get out of there, but where would I go? It wasn't in the middle of the desert, and any attempt to escape could be even more dangerous. It was then that, suddenly, the whistling stopped. Silence once again dominated the environment. Carter offers motionless, waiting for something to happen. But everything was quiet. He looked at the knife in his hand, feeling sweat running down his face. Cautiously, he unzipped the tent again and left. The flashlight was still next to the entrance and he quickly picked it up. As he illuminated the surrounding desert, he noticed that the figure had disappeared. The place where she was standing was empty, as if she had never been there. Despite being relieved, Carter knew he wasn't safe. He'll probably get out of there. In a desperate rush, he began to hurriedly dismantle his camp, storing everything in his backpack. He knew the desert could be treacherous at night, but anything was better than staying in that location. When he finally finished, he threw his backpack over his back and began walking quickly towards the nearest road. The fear was still there, but he knew he needed to keep going. As he walked, he heard the wind whispering around him, but this time the associate was gone. After hours of walking through the dark desert, Carter finally reached the road and, with luck, managed to catch a ride to the nearest town. He never told anyone about what happened that night. Even after so long, he still wondered what that figure was and why it was chasing him. Since then, Carter has never returned to the desert to camp. The place he loved had become a living nightmare, and he knew that, somewhere in the shadows of the desert, that figure was still watching him, waiting for the next time he made the mistake of returning. The Utah Mountain Disappearance. Camping in the mountains has always been Samantha's biggest passion. Since she was a child, she grew up alongside her family exploring the great peaks of Utah. Among his favorite places was Mount Nebo, one of the highest mountains in the state. The views were stunning, and the isolation of the trails made her feel like she was truly connected to nature. However, the connection she loved so much was about to turn into a nightmare that would stay with her for the rest of her life. It was summer, and Samantha had decided to go camping alone for the first time. Although her family and friends had to insist that she take someone along, she wanted this solitary experience as a personal challenge. Prepare all the necessary equipment: tent, supplies, and even an emergency communications radio. Everything was planned to be a smooth adventure. She arrived at the park in the early afternoon, pitched her tent in a clearing in the middle of the forest, and prepared to spend the night alone under the stars. The weather was perfect, with clear skies and a light wind blowing through the trees. Samantha felt completely at peace. He spent the first few hours exploring the surroundings and taking photos of the local flora and fauna. However, as night approached, the wind began to change. The air became colder and thicker, and a strange feeling began to wash over Samantha. She tried to push away the negative thoughts, telling herself it was just nerves from the first night camping alone. But upon returning to camp, something caught his attention. In the distance, among the trees, Samantha saw what appeared to be a figure. It was difficult to distinguish as the sun was setting and the shadows of the trees made it difficult to see. The figure was standing still, about 100 meters away, simply looking in his direction. Samantha frowned, trying to understand what she was selling. Was it another camper? An animal? She blinked and the figure was gone. Feeling a shiver run up her spine, Samantha decided it was time to light the fire and prepare for the night. As he collected wood for the fire, his thoughts kept returning to the mysterious figure. Something didn't feel right, but she tried to ignore the feeling. When night finally fell, Samantha sat by the fire, looking up at the stars in the sky. The silence of the mountain, which was normally comforting, now felt oppressive. The sound of the wind rustling the trees was all she could hear. She tried to relax, but the discomfort she felt since seeing that figure wouldn't go away. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her. A courtly branch, as if someone had stepped on it. Samantha quickly turned around but saw nothing but trees and shadows. The heart started to beat faster. It must just be an animal, she thought, trying to remain calm. But then another branch is cut, this time closer. Samantha took out her flashlight and indicated the direction of the sound, illuminating the woods. Again there was nothing. However, the feeling of being watched intensified. She knew something was there, hidden in the darkness, but she couldn't see it. He decided to go into the tent and lock the zipper, trying to convince himself that it was safe. The wind continued to blow outside, and the sound of the trees swaying made her uneasy. She grabbed the emergency radio and placed it next to her in case she needed to communicate with someone. However, as soon as she got comfortable, she heard a noise that made her stop breathing. It was a laugh. Faint, almost like a suggestion, but clearly a laugh. And it was coming from somewhere outside the tent. Samantha froze. Her eyes widened with fear and she gripped the radio tightly. The laughter continued for a few seconds, and then silence took over again. Trying to control her panic, she whispered to herself, "It's not real. This can't be happening." But deep down she knew something was very wrong. No one should be on the mountain at this time of night, and certainly no one should be laughing. For a few minutes, silence. But suddenly Samantha took steps. Heavy footsteps, as if someone was walking around your tent. The sound got closer every second. She grabbed the knife she kept at the bottom of her backpack, ready to defend herself, but fear paralyzed her. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent entrance, and for a moment, everything was silent again. Then the tent started to move. Something, or someone, was touching the fabric of the tent on the outside, slowly running their fingers along the sides. Samantha gripped the knife tighter, her eyes fixed on the entrance. She knew that if that thing got in, she would have to fight for her life. But before she could react, a soft, distorted voice whispered, "Get out." It was enough for Samantha to lose control. With a scream of pure terror, she ripped the zipper off her tent and ran into the forest. The sound of her own footsteps was drowned out by the adrenaline, and she could barely breathe as she ran through the trees. She didn't know where she was going, she just knew she needed to get away from that place. Panic took over his mind, and the only thing he could think of was escape. Samantha ran for about 10 minutes until she finally stopped, panting and sweating. He looked around, trying to get his bearings, but he was lost. The forest seemed like a maze of shadows, and she couldn't remember where she had run. It was then that I heard it again. A laugh. She turned quickly but saw nothing. The sound seemed to be coming from all sides, echoing through the trees. The feeling of being seen returned, stronger than ever. Desperate, Samantha chose the radio and tried to call for help. "Help. I need help," she said, but the radio was silent. No response came. She began a slow walk, trying to find her way back to the camp, but something to follow. It wasn't just a sensation, she could hear the footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing behind her. When he finally saw the light of his fire in the distance, a wave of collapse came tomorrow. She ran towards the camp, but when she arrived, what she saw left her in shock. His tent was destroyed as it was torn apart by something very strong. Claw marks were clear on the sides, and their belongings were scattered everywhere. Samantha knew I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. He grabbed what he could of his belongings and started down the trail towards the parking lot. Fear kept her on alert, and the feeling of being followed didn't leave her. When he finally reached his car, he got in and locked the doors, still panting and shaking. She looked out the window and for a moment, thought she saw the same distant figure she had seen before. But now he was closer, standing between the trees watching her. Samantha drove the car and sped off down the winding mountain road. She never returned to Mount Nebo. The place that was once their refuge was now a grim reminder of a terrifying night. To this day, Samantha doesn't know who or what chased her that night. And she never camped alone again. The tent of terror in the Oregon woods. Remote camping in Oregon's Umpqua National Forest was a tradition for David and his friends. They've been doing this for years. They always looked for the most isolated place possible, where they could fish, tell stories and completely disconnect from the outside world. But on that last trip, something changed. What should have been a peaceful weekend in nature turned into a nightmare neither of them would ever forget. David, along with his friends Ben, Mike and Tyler, arrived at the scene in the early afternoon. The weather was pleasant, the air was fresh, and the gentle sound of the nearby river created a relaxing atmosphere. They set up their tents in a clearing near the riverbank and as always drank beer and told jokes. The day passed quickly and when night fell, a bonfire was raging, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. The full moon shone in the sky, partially illuminating the camp. Everyone was relaxed, enjoying the company and the silence of the forest. But around midnight, something unusual happened. While the four were sitting around the campfire, they heard a strange sound coming from inside the forest. It was a high-pitched sound like a distant scream, followed by regretful silence. Everyone stopped talking immediately and tension took over the group. "What was that?" Ben said, frowning. "Probably an animal," Mike replied, trying to remain calm. But everyone knew that that sound wasn't from any animal they knew. The silence of the forest now seemed heavier, oppressive. The trees before imports now hid something. David tried to relax, but he felt a growing uneasiness. He looked around and noticed that the shadows around the camp were moving strangely, almost as if something was lurking in the darkness. "Let's go for a walk," Tyler suggested, trying to diffuse the tension. The others agreed, although the idea of leaving the clearing and entering the forest now didn't seem as safe as it had before. They took their flashlights and followed a path that led to the river. The sound of running water was soothing, and for a few minutes, everyone forgot about the strange sound it made. However, as they advanced along the trail, David felt that sensation of being watched again. He looked around but only saw darkness between the trees. Suddenly, Ben stopped and was mentioned to something ahead. "Do you see this?" he whispered. Everyone looked in the same direction, and in the dim light of the flashlights, they saw what appeared to be a figure standing among the trees. It was difficult to tell whether it was a person or an animal, but the silhouette was motionless, looking straight at them. The group froze. Nobody knew what to do. Fear began to grip each of them. David felt his stomach drop, and an icy chill ran down his spine. Something about that figure felt very wrong. It was as if she didn't belong there. "Let's go back to camp," David said, trying to remain calm. They began to back away slowly without taking their eyes off the figure. But before he could turn around completely, the sound returned. This time, louder and closer, the same high-pitched scream that was heard before. But now it seemed to be coming from all directions. The group ran back to camp, hearts racing. When they reached the clearing, they lit more wood on the fire, hoping the light and heat would bring some comfort. But the tension was not palpable. For a while, I was silent, hearing only the sound of the fire crackling. No one knew exactly what to do or say. Then, suddenly, something moved in the surrounding trees. Everyone stood up, staring into the darkness. The forest felt alive, as if it were surrounding the camp. "There's something there," Mike muttered, picking up a hunting knife he always carried. Before he could react, the breaking branches and crushing leaves echoed through the clearing. The figure I had seen before was now much closer. They could see the outlines of a skeletal body, but the details remained hidden in the darkness. It was as if the shadows were protecting it. Suddenly, an absent figure. "This isn't real. This can't be confirmed," Ben whispered, his face clear with terror. It was then that David's tent began to shake. Something, or someone, was inside. All four stood frozen, their fear growing by the second. The tent moved as if something was trying to get out of it. David took a step forward, trying to gather his courage, but before he could do anything, the tent's zipper began to slowly open. The tension was not unbearable. Everyone held their breaths, expecting the worst. And then absolute silence took over the forest again. David finally reached the tent, held the zipper tight and looked inside. It was empty. Nothing had been touched, but the zipper remained open as if something had entered or exited. The group didn't wait to find out what it was. In a panic, he ended up dismantling the camp as quickly as he could. The feeling of being gifted never left them, and each noise they heard seemed more threatening than the last. With everything packed, they ran along the trail back to the car without looking back. The forest, which had always been a place of peace and fun, now felt like an enemy surrounding them, ready to attack them at any moment. When we finally reached the car, we hurriedly got out and sped off down the dirt road. No one said a word on the way back. Whatever was in those woods had followed them, David was sure of that. And he knew it would never be clear again. Even after years, none of the four friends could explain what they saw that night. But they all agree on one thing. Something was hunting them. Something that is still there, hidden deep within the Umpqua forest. The sinister echo in the Vermont hills. Jessica has always been passionate about outdoor adventures. She and her boyfriend, Ryan, used to camp in remote locations to escape the city grind. During one of our summer vacations, we decided to explore a more isolated place, in the hills of Vermont, a mountainous region surrounded by dense forests and known for its beautiful trails and impressive views. They arrived at the location just after sunset, with only the twinkling stars illuminating the night. They set up camp near a small stream that ran through the hills, surrounded by trees that touched the sky. The plan was simple: spend the night there and explore the trails in the morning. Little did they know that this trip would become one of the most terrifying experiences of their lives. The first part of the night was peaceful. The sound of running water and the crackling of the campfire created a relaxing atmosphere. Jessica and Ryan talked about the trails they wanted to explore the next day and laughed remembering past adventures. They were completely disconnected from the outside world, and that was exactly what they wanted. Around 11 o'clock at night, they both decided to go to the tent. The absolute silence of the forest surrounded them, but there was something strange in the air. Jessica couldn't define what it was, but she felt a slight uneasiness. She informed Ryan, but he laughed, saying she was probably just tired from the trip. However, as soon as they turned off the lights and went to bed, a soft sound reached Jessica's ears. It was something distant, like an echo, but it didn't seem natural. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Ryan frowned and was silent for a moment. "It must be the wind," he replied without giving much importance. Jessica tried to relax, but the sound continued. It was as if someone, or something, was whispering far away, but with a cadence that bothered her deeply. Deciding to check, Jessica left the tent, grabbed her flashlight and illuminated the darkness around the camp. Everything seemed normal, the trees swayed gently in the wind, and the stream continued to flow smoothly. But the sound, that distant echo, was still there. "Is anyone there?" she called, feeling a little silly for speaking out loud. Silence was the only answer. He returned to the tent, still suspicious, but tried to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. As the hours passed, and into the early hours of the morning, Jessica was kept awake by a more intense noise. It looked like something was moving near the camp. It was sent quickly and woke Ryan up. "I heard it again. There's someone walking around," she said, now alarmed. Ryan, still drowsy, grabbed a flashlight and went out to investigate. As he walked around the tent, he noticed fresh footprints on the ground, but he didn't recognize the tracks. "There are footprints here," he said with a look of confusion. "But it doesn't look like an animal, or a person." Fear began to take over both of them. They returned to the tent, zipped it up and remained silent, listening intently. The sound of footsteps returned, closer this time. It seemed like something was walking around the camp, moving slowly as if it was trying not to be detected. Jessica took out her cell phone and checked if there was a signal. Nothing. They were completely isolated. Suddenly the footsteps stopped. A dead silence took over the place and for a few seconds nothing happened. But then an even more disturbing sound echoed through the forest. A high-pitched scream as if someone was calling for help. Jessica looked at Ryan, terrified. "Someone is in danger," she said. Ryan hesitated. "That doesn't seem right. Who screams like that at this time in the middle of nowhere?" Jessica wanted to help, but something about the way the scream echoed through the forest made her back away. It was as if the sound was distorted, as if it wasn't coming from a person, but from something imitating a human. It was then that they both heard, "Ryan? Jessica." The voice was faint but clear enough to let them know that someone, or something, knew their names. Panic took over both of them. Ryan grabbed a hunting knife and Jessica grabbed a flashlight. They stood at the entrance to the tent, waiting for whatever was outside to reveal itself. The sound of leaves being trampled filled the air again, and the invisible presence seemed to be getting closer and closer. "This isn't real, this isn't real," Jessica repeated, trying to shake off the terror. But at that moment, the tent began to sway as if someone was pulling on the sides. Dread turned to despair. Ryan took courage and ran out of the tent with the knife in hand, ready to face whatever it was. Jessica panicked at the sound, but when she left, what she saw left her paralyzed. The trees around the camp were covered in strange symbols, as if someone had carved markings into the waterfalls overnight. And in the moonlight, they could see figures moving among the trees, shadows moving quickly, impossible to identify. Without waiting to find out more, they both ran towards the car, leaving the campsite behind. The shadows that chased them, the feeling that something evil was behind them grew with every second. Upon reaching the car, they locked the doors and drove off at high speed along the winding hill road. Looking in the rearview mirror, Jessica still saw the shadows between the trees, watching them as they drove away. That night they did not return to camp. They left everything behind: tent, supplies, and even happy memories of previous adventures. Nothing more important was than escaping. When they reached the nearest town, they were both shaken. They tried to tell what had happened, but they knew no one would believe them. The strange footprints, the symbols on the trees and the shadows that followed them were something they could never explain. Since that night, Jessica and Ryan have never camped again. The terror they felt in the hills of Vermont was enough to convince them that sometimes what we watch in the shadows should not be disturbed. Did you like this story? Do you have something incredible to share? If you or someone you know has had a hair-raising experience in traffic, whether as a driver or passenger, send your story. Who knows, it might appear in our next video. Send your report in the comments or by email, and let's explore the mysteries of the road together.